10 seconds. Okay, hi everyone. I think we're live. We are so excited to be with all of you today. I think I saw somewhere 150 plus folks are in this session today. It's the 8th session of Build Palestine's 2-day global summit. Really quick housekeeping. We started a little late, so we're not going to spend much time here. Just feel free to chat in your questions ongoing. We will leave 15 minutes at the end for your questions, but feel free to just send them in throughout this conversation. While today's conversation will be in English, there is translation and interpretation services. المحادثة اليوم سوف تكون باللغة الإنجليزية للمتحدثين باللغة العربية. الرجاء اضغطوا على رابط المحادثة للدخول الترجمة. So with that, I wanted to welcome everyone today. My name is Aziza Musa. I am proudly serving on the board of Build Palestine. In addition, I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Development for Health Leads, which is an innovation hub that's focused on addressing the root cause of health disparities here in the United States. And I bring that up for a couple of reasons. I wanted to join Health Leads because I felt that having been a fundraiser for 15 years for various education and environmental causes, I felt that billions of dollars were being spent by philanthropy on tertiary care to essentially soften the impact or soften the blow of chronic illness and disease. And I wanted to be something that was instead daring to ask the question, what would it actually take to prevent those diseases in the first place? And I really felt that the way the resources, financial resources were flowing was essentially, and this sounds nefarious, but it's how I felt and continue to feel, that we were in the business of managing disease and not preventing it. And so that in part was the genesis for today's topic, donor dependency and the role of philanthropy tackling the root cause. And so joining me today, for this conversation, I'm very excited to have two incredible and fearless leaders. We have Nora Murad, writer, activist, educator. Hopefully all of you had a chance to read her and Moukhtar's bios. We have Moukhtar Kocache, who has been in philanthropy for 30 years in various capacities. He's a consultant and he's the head of strategy and partnerships for Rawa, Creative Palestinian Communities Fund. Unfortunately, I just want to let the audience know our third panelist, Yara Salem, who is the new Director General of Taawon. Unfortunately, she had something, a personal matter come up at the last minute, so she's not able to join us. Obviously, I know we're disappointed because she would have brought in a really interesting perspective as the largest local grant maker in Palestine. But I think we're going to be okay with this group because not only have we've been on both sides. As nonprofit leaders, but also as fundraisers and as grant makers, and donors to our own causes as well. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Nora and Murad, as you know, the objective that we hope to have for the audience today is to first do some problem identification analysis around the issue of international aid. And whether you agree, as many have said and documented over the years, that it's actually done more harm than good in this post-Oslo era. In the second half, we'll shift our attention to solutions and ideas, because I think it was Jihad who in one of the earlier sessions said the future is really all we have to radically reimagine. And so, so we will kind of look at what would it take to reimagine the role of philanthropy in supporting really high impact root cause aligned initiatives. But first, can we ground ourselves in the numbers for a second? Because I was doing some reading in preparation for today, and according to a 2020 article in Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, for example, unemployment, if you look across all the various dimensions of the social determinants of health, which make up a healthy community and society, unemployment in the West Bank and Gaza has increased by 25%. If you look at all the other dimensions, life expectancy, air pollution, food insecurity, for example, is 8 times higher in the West Bank and Gaza than it is in Israel. More than 25% of those who live in Gaza don't have adequate sewage treatment. So I can go on and on and on, right? The list is long and it's depressing. My first question is for Nora. Actually, I'm gonna direct the first question for Moukhtar to ground us a little bit in the landscape. Moukhtar, you've been a leader in the philanthropic sector for 30 years. You managed a huge portfolio for the Ford Foundation for 9 years. And your portfolio included Palestine as well as other countries in the MENA region. So I'm curious, now at Rawa Fund, you have a community-centric and participatory approach. Given your immersion in Palestinian civil society, both as a donor and as a grant maker and implementer, can you just tell the audience how dependent are Palestinians on aid right now, and what's the landscape?
Sure, thanks Aziza, and glad that Nora was able to make it. Sorry that Yara couldn't make it. And I'm just really happy to be part of this community and able to speak today about something that I'm really passionate about, and that has really structured kind of my passion and my professional career and my political self as well. And I'm extremely excited today to actually wear my first white shirt in months. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to dress up and not just be in my pajamas. Look, you know, according to various interpretations and various numbers over the years, Palestinians receive or at various times have received in the past decade the largest donor aid, per capita aid in the world. And you know, one of the determinants of a healthy development landscape, we think about it, in fact, as an ecology. And just like any ecology, it needs to be balanced. And the funding or the development ecology needs to also be balanced in terms of both the responsibilities and the inputs and resources and the policies of various actors that make up this entire ecology. And so obviously the public sector plays a role, the private sector plays a role, development aid, philanthropy, individual, as well as capital that emanates from communities themselves, and not just financial capital, but human capital, intellectual capital, leadership capital. And so, you know, we need to think about sort of development as this kind of ecology, which is also fragile, where all of the elements are interdependent. At the start of the Oslo process, there was a sense that the Palestinian project was to be tackled like any other developing nation paradigm. Okay, so you know, experts came together. There was an excitement about building a nation state, and people started to work. But what really followed as a result is, in fact, the creation of a dramatically unbalanced ecology. As the Israeli colonization project has advanced, with tacit support of the international community, and in some instances, we could also think it was even abetted by international donors who removed, in a sense, the burden on the Israeli government and the Israeli society, coupled with consecutive failures of true and consistent Palestinian governance, and add to that a Palestinian economy that is crippled at all levels, really dysfunctional and artificial sustained development ecology became, sadly, the norm. Donor aid and international philanthropy and charitable giving have occupied a grotesquely massive space, shaping the fabric of Palestinian society without necessarily intending to. So as a result, for instance, Palestinian society is unnaturally NGOized. So as civil society has stepped in to fill in the various voids in the ecology, as I mentioned, so no public sector, no international dimension, the economy doesn't work. So civil society has mushroomed to fill in that void. To address the needs of the population. International aid should fill in usually the gaps within a society and in an environment, in a development environment, rather than be the main momentum of that builds society as it currently does in the Palestinian landscape. Just a couple of more ideas here. Today, the dependency is of massive proportions, with still most of the aid going to support basic services. Something that one usually sees in small periods of time or in moments of emergency or a crisis, but not rather in a situation that becomes the norm and the status quo. The most significant negative factor remains the unabetted Israeli colonization and hegemony and the consistent degradation of Palestinian self-determination and autonomy. So we need to also, as we analyze the situation and critique it, I know there's a lot of frustration, rightly so, with the issue of donor aid in Palestine, but I hope that my small explanation demonstrates that in the context of Palestine, there is an imbalance in the ecology and therefore a significant amount of disturbance and power that emanates from the resources that are channeled through the donor aid. So it's important to understand that every source of funding that is allocated to development comes with its own cultural, political, moral, practical dimensions and repercussions, as well as conditions. So the fact that there is this imbalance in the ecology has created the situation that we're in. And I'm happy later on to talk about what in practice the impact has resulted on the Palestinian society as a result of this dynamic.
That's really powerful. And what was interesting about what you just said is that it extends beyond civil society and civic organizations and kind of community health and social health problems, because I even remember reading a World Bank report that said something like VCs are having a really hard time investing in commercially viable ideas because foreign aid has in many ways had the unintended impact of essentially diluting the Palestinian society's ability to pressure test products and find product market fit in a way that happens in other societies. Let's shift to Nora for a moment. You founded the first Palestinian Community Foundation, the Delia Association, and you later went on, because that was not ambitious enough, you later went on to found AidWatch. So from your perspective, what do you think we as a nonprofit sector have learned about the role and impact of donor and foreign aid, that the heads, I'm assuming that we have some heads of nonprofit and social enterprise leaders with us today. What do they need to consider in their own strategic fundraising and in their strategic grant making?
Thank you for having me today. I'd like to say that my comments and my observations are grounded both in my experience as a non-Palestinian member of the Palestinian community, from having Palestinian children and married into a Palestinian family, living in Palestine for 13 years and founding and co-founding two organizations aimed specifically at reducing dependence on aid, as well as my experience in the United States as an anti-racist activist. You asked the question, how dependent are Palestinians on aid? And I'd like to distinguish between economic dependence and psychological dependence. I think Palestinians, in my experience, are extremely psychologically dependent on aid. But we really don't know how economically dependent Palestinians are, because so much of the aid money repatriates back to the donor communities. I remember at a UNDP meeting many years ago, probably more than 10 years ago, civil society said that they believed 80% of international aid that came into Palestine ultimately went back to donor countries. That might be a bit high. Let's say that it's 70%. If 70% of aid is going back to donor countries, how dependent are Palestinians on aid? Maybe less than we think. Also, you have the reality that the way that aid is provided requires enormous expenditures of money and time on things that are not really priorities of the Palestinian people. And I mean the administrative side, accounting, reporting, blah, 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 certain kinds of needs assessment, et cetera, but also on the activity side, the amount of money that goes into democracy workshops or whatever activities that are not priorities of communities. So what if we didn't have that money and we didn't do those things? So what? I'm really not convinced that Palestinians are actually that dependent on aid. You also asked if aid is doing more harm than good. We could look at that strictly from an economic perspective, and we'd have to say, we don't know. I mean, without aid, people wouldn't eat, potentially. If I look at it just that way, I'd have to say, no, Palestinians need aid, because without aid, you know, there'd be no food, there'd be no water, or less food and less water. But again, I think it's really problematic looking only within that frame. The biggest harm that international aid has caused is relieving Israel of its legal obligation to provide for the well-being of the protected population, protected by international humanitarian law. And by shifting the costs of the occupation from Israel onto the international community, the occupation is not only free to Israel, but it's a huge profit-making opportunity for them, because Israel has captured markets in the West Bank and Gaza, and the costs of occupying are borne by the international community. I think the harm, when you look at it from that point of view, is definitely more than the good. The last thing that I'd like to take up, just building on a few things that have been said before, Aziza, I think you said something about the unintended consequences of aid. I really believe they are intended consequences. I don't even think the international community pretends that these are unintended consequences. The whole concept of aid in the Oslo agreements was aid to calm Palestinians down so that there would not be resistance against the peace process, which turned out to be not a peace process and not a process at all, and expired a decade ago anyway. So I'm trying to think about how Palestinians and all of us who care about Palestinians and who care about the global South, which is very much, as Moukhtar said, embedded and entrenched in the aid system, how could we be less psychologically dependent on aid? And I think one thing we could do is stop calling it aid, because aid is helpful. I aid my neighbors because we're in a COVID lockdown. And when they need food at the store, I aid them by going to the store. My neighbors aid me by bringing me food on days that I can't go out for myself. Aid is good. Aid is helpful. Aid is humanitarian. If we called what we now call aid, if we called it, let's say, a neo-colonial intervention, would we say that we're dependent on that? Are we dependent on a neo-colonial intervention? I'm not sure. I think a lot of it is perhaps in the way we're framing the situation, that we are perpetuating it, and there's huge, huge opportunities for us to climb out of this thing that we consider dependency on aid.
Nora, that is so fascinating, and I'm watching the chat. This is clearly resonating with so much of our audience. I want to push you for a moment on the issue of, because Moukhtar, I remember when we were prepping for this session, at one point you said, Aziza, it's really important that we frame for the audience that there are many different types of resources in aid. And so are we using the same definition, the broadest, in the broadest sense, to include bilateral government donors, international organizations, public foundations, and private foundations? That's a theoretical question. I'm going to parking lot to the side for a second, but assuming we are. When you mentioned earlier, Nora, the amount of work, if there are any fundraisers on this call like me who spend an inordinate amount of time on reporting and just ridiculous time trying to bend yourself into a pretzel to fit XYZ funders' requirements, we all know what that's like. And some organizations are better than others at avoiding mission creep in this way. But I am curious. I know there are foundations. I see Reem Khalil on the call from Drosos Foundation, for example. There are leaders out there who are really trying to do the right thing, really try to invest in high impact solutions. And so when you tell them something like, and I think this moment in time is pushing us all to consider why we do the things we do. And our workplaces are infested with white supremacist cultural practices. But if a foundation leader, and Moukhtar, this is a great question for you too, if a foundation leader were to come to you and say, you're telling me to invest in root cause, how am I supposed to measure it if people don't report back to me? I'll let whoever wants to start take that.
Go ahead, Moukhtar.
Go, Nora.
It's either way.
Well, look, I do think that it is important for us to distinguish for the different types of resources that exist, you know, in supporting civil society and the various, you know, elements of society in general, especially in Palestine. And this frustration with aid is legitimate, and it's ubiquitous throughout the Arab region and also the global South, rightly so. Because I would add to your critique, Aziza, of the kind of patriarchal, you know, patronizing dimension to it all, whereas there is a political underlining that is at the heart of the issues of inequity, whereas, you know, and this aid and that kind of support, which trickles down in a patriarchal manner, only just solidifies the power imbalance that is at stake. But I do think that, you know, if, you know, I come less from the aid world and more from the philanthropy world and the kind of foundations world and the international organization world, I see that a lot of the work that such organizations are trying to do is also derailed by the donor aid dependency and the imbalance that I mentioned earlier. So, you might have, a group of Palestinian organizations might have a really good collegial relationship with another international organization, and they might start partnering, and resources might flow, say, to support women's projects or agriculture. But because the environment that they are functioning in is so dysfunctional, that it means that a lot of the work that they're trying to do then becomes very complicated. So, if we're trying to increase earned income, for instance, and independence of local organizations, that's going to depend on the economic environment in which these organizations work in. And so, this issue of needing to align this problem analysis with the kind of meta reality, which is a political reality, a colonial reality, an economic, the lack of a viable economic reality. So people get excited about the role of the public sector, the role of the public sector. What public sector? I mean, what are we talking about? It is really infinitesimal. I mean, the Palestinian economy is disheveled. So, again, it's the fact that the entire sort of sphere is imbalanced means that all these various actors, whether it is the private sector, whether it is foundation work, whether it is individual philanthropists, aren't necessarily contributing to the kind of, they're not adding the right elements to the environment, because the environment to begin with is dysfunctional, right? So then you have this very unsustainable situation, right? So I definitely agree that with Nora, there is we need to decolonize our minds and the way we organize ourselves and imagine civic work, because it has been completely formatted and traumatized by the kind of the paradigms of aid and international organizations that have been imposed on Palestinian civil society, and moved the energy from grassroots organizing into professionalized NGO apparatuses that, aren't necessarily as efficient as they can be, nor can we expect them to, given the dysfunction, the general dysfunction in the environment. So, this is this is a really important issue to sort of contend with. Nora, hopefully I've given you enough to think about a response.
That's great, Moukhtar. And so add to that, Nora, because I think it's hard when you're talking about decolonizing the mind, and I'm seeing a lot of interest in the chat around psychological dependence on aid. So there's a lot wrapped up in this topic, but what I find is that it's really a nebulous topic for people to start thinking about. Where on earth do I start in terms of decolonizing the mind, and then decolonizing the systems and processes that flow from that, both as a grant maker and as a fundraiser and nonprofit leader? If you could give one tactical solution in terms of just start here, what can you give us, Nora?
For me, it is to design all processes with respect for self-determination. In other words, not to obsess on how money is used, because whether that grant money is used to run a workshop or to buy food, next week it's all gone anyway. But rather, maybe to emphasize the process of decision-making over those resources, because self-determination isn't something that we have to wait for from someone else. It's something that we can practice in the way that we do philanthropy. And this is a place where philanthropy is so different from aid, because both perhaps are political, but there's a huge amount of more leeway in private philanthropy. Whether it's big or small, there's more leeway to do less harm than there is within governmental aid systems. I mean, this book is a great book for people to consider. It's called Smart Risks: How Small Grants Are Helping to Solve some of the world's biggest problems. And I have 2 chapters in this book, but one of them is about financial reports. Everybody has to do financial reports. You were talking about reporting a few minutes ago. You have to do financial reports. Why? To be accountable to the donor? Yes, but more, I think, to be accountable to the community, because as far as I'm concerned, the money already belongs to them, which is why I think people who are affected by the use of the money should be the ones who are deciding how to use the money. That to me is self-determination. So what we learned in Dahlia Association, and this was many years ago, was that when we asked them, let's say they got a grant of $4,000, because Dahlia Association does very small grants. Let's say they got a grant of $4,000. We'd ask them to do a financial report to report out on the $4,000. Then we'd ask them to do a narrative report to report out on what they did, what was the project. And they did these reports in open public meetings. They were not written reports, and they were not to us. They were reports they gave back to their own communities. But the first time we did it was totally mind-blowing, because there was obviously no way that with this $4,000, they did that amazing amount of work. So what became clear was that the way that we requested the financial report actually invisibilized the local contribution. We only asked them to tell us what they did with the grant they got from Dahlia Association. But the amount that was invested far, far, far exceeded in labor and in money. So by subsequently requesting financial reports that reported out on the whole project, what became very obvious to the community was that Dahlia's $4,000 grant was small in relation to the amount of the local resources that they had been able to mobilize. For me, that is a tangible example of how we can transcend the psychological aid dependence, to realize how few of the actual things that we need to do require money at all. They require resources, but Palestine has resources. Palestine has people and skills and languages and connections and faith and culture and history and ideas and energy. There is so much we can do without money or without a lot of money.
That's incredible. And I think there are some examples out there, Dahlia being one of them, Rawa being another, where you're really
I can follow
reimagining it.
Sorry, Aziza, to interrupt. I can follow up just to sort of, again, pick up on some great ideas. I'm going
to let you say, I'm going to give you 1 minute, and then we're going to shift to chat questions because we have so many to get to.
Yeah, just to highlight how the issue of where the money comes from is so significant in terms of who do we have to respond to, who do we have to be accountable to, and what kind of legal fiduciary responsibilities do we need to kind of document and provide as a result of where that money comes from? So, obviously, in kind of theoretical terms, if the German citizens have contributed from their taxes money to go to the global south, somehow there needs to be these uber, pun intended, dramatic reporting to sort of, show where that money went. So, but when the money comes from local sources, community philanthropy, individual donors, then that allows us to proceed in a very different kind of transaction, which is much more built on solidarity, equity, and where the act of giving and taking is no longer built on based on these power imbalances, but rather on a shared, collegial, solidarity-based, mutual process. And it's exactly what Dalia was able to innovate with a decade ago, and that's the spirit of kind of community philanthropy and participatory philanthropy that we are also experimenting with at Rawa, and hoping that as a methodology and as a toolkit and as an ethos, those things can inspire new ways of mobilizing and acting on the ground moving forward.
Thank you, Moukhtar. I am looking at the chat, and we have so many questions. I think the concept of mindset changing and psychological dependence is clearly a major theme. Muna Dejani asks Nora, how can we change mindsets that aid could and should be contested on an ideational level, in addition to a grassroots level? How can we make it mainstream? So I actually feel like the first part of the question you answered, but to the second part, how can we make it mainstream to challenge the toxic aid mentality and not always be a small radical margin?
Yeah, that's really tough. Wow, that is so tough, because aid has increased the inequality within Palestine. So there's now, what's often called the Ramallah bubble, a very economically and politically powerful minority of people who have great benefit from aid. Huge hotels, huge restaurants, houses in many countries, etc. I think that it's probably not going to happen without getting rid of and dismantling the Palestinian Authority. The role that the Palestinian Authority plays, receiving politically conditioned money and providing that through society in very political and controlling ways, is so anti-liberation. I think when we're talking about aid and the aid system as a system of oppression, we also have to talk about the Palestinian Authority as a system of oppression, and also the Israeli occupation. It is a step-by-step process. And at the same time, it's not a step-by-step process. We're not going to get there with technical fixes or small improvements to the system. We're going to get there by thinking really differently and then implementing those different thoughts in small ways and moving towards that radical reimagining that we're talking about. I'm frustrated that I can't be more concrete at this exact moment, because I recognize that that's important.
Well, and I'm also really loving the chat, because we have participatory solutions happening in the chat where one audience member says, I believe, Reem Khalil from Drosa says, I believe circulating or promoting success stories of community initiatives is one way to change mindsets. So the idea of case studies and what's working out there, I think is huge. A question for Murad. So this is actually a really interesting one, and I so appreciate it because it's so hard to do this work on the ground. So kudos to all the NGO leaders on here. What to do when local NGOs have little abilities or skills to come up with the innovative solutions? You're telling us to solve root causes, but we don't even have the necessary or requisite resources sometimes, or time or energy, when we're dealing with putting out fires all the time. I'm paraphrasing that part, but the question is, what do you do when you don't have the necessary abilities and skills to come up with innovative solutions to solve root cause?
Right. So I can just tell you what we did at Dahlia Association, but I'm sure that there are other really exciting ways to do it. At Dahlia Association, we learned that if you say to people, as the traditional way, both in aid and philanthropy, if you say to people, we have $10,000 grants for water projects, everybody comes up with $10,000 grants for water projects. It's amazing how everybody is going to do a water project, and amazing. They all are worth $10,000. But if you go to a community and you say, you have $4,000 that you can use any way you choose, and all we expect of you is that it be a group decision and that it be a transparent decision-making process. It takes them, honestly, 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks of community discussion because they have never been allowed to think through their own priorities before. The priorities have always been established in Oslo or in Tokyo or in Washington, D.C. That process is not it's not an obstacle to the grant. It is the grant. That space where they have 6 or 8 or 10 weeks or a year, however long it takes, not within a grant cycle, but however long it takes to figure out their own priorities to use $4, $3, or $2, or even $1,000, that is self-determination. And I guarantee you, they are unbelievably innovative. I wish we had a whole other hour to talk about the innovations I've seen when people are allowed to figure out and then act on their own priorities. I disagree that local communities are not innovative. I do believe our processes undermine them.
That's going to be the tagline. Give us room. Throw out the grant cycle. We have the call to action for funders. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'm going to give Moukhtar, you each have 1 minute. Final question, wrap up, closing remarks. What is, so we've talked about a lot of problems, and the problems are depressing and sometimes overwhelming. Let's end on a high note here for the audience. Moukhtar, what is exciting you about this moment? What is giving you hope for the future? And how does this moment, we're dealing with so much at a global level, at a national level in Palestine, what does this moment reveal in terms of opportunities for you?
I think this is, this is an issue and a question on the minds of communities all around the planet. And there's a moment and there's a momentum of creativity and agency that is developing all over the place. There are concrete matters that we can begin to roll out today that we should have rolled out yesterday by looking at models of community philanthropy, by looking at how we channel individual comes from Palestinians already, and also the Palestinian diaspora. I'm afraid to say that often individual donors and corporate donors from Palestine and beyond and in the diaspora channel their funds also in a patriarchal, patronizing kind of tying your hands down kind of a format, because those are the kind of structures that have been adopted by the kind of colonial paradigm, but also because there are stringent regulations and legal and fiduciary requirements on Palestinians their philanthropy as well. But we can put resources in a horizontal manner rather than in a vertical manner at the hands of communities. I often say you can't teach someone how to dance if they don't actually put on the music and dance, right? So the best way of practicing community giving, decision-making, collective decision-making, civic engagement is practiced. It is not something that is passed down into, through a grants application. And so we can put resources at the community level, and we know there are incredible new mechanisms, including participatory and community philanthropy methods to allow communities to make their own decisions about how best to solve problems at the community level.
Nora, close us out. You heard what Moukhtar is excited for the future. What about you? What gives you hope? And with that, we will wrap and go to Dalia's video. What gives you hope, Nora?
A lot. I encourage people to contact me directly to continue this conversation, because we did not even start, much less finish. This is what I would leave everybody with. Not just the book, but the title of the book. The revolution will not be funded. The revolution will not be funded. Most of the work that we need to do as a community does not need to be funded. That's what I would leave with. And I'm hopeful that we're at a time in the world, with the leadership of the movement for Black Lives in the United States, to really narrow in on the toxic power that the United States has, which is affecting the whole world and especially the global South. I'm very hopeful that we can revert and pivot towards a more liberatory approach rather than perhaps what we've fallen into.
Thank you both so much. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, audience, for your incredible questions. And stay with us, because we're going into a promotional video for the Dalia Association now. So stay with us, and thank you all so, so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.